Okay, so now let's talk about something more intense, and this is very important, especially if you're going to medicine and nursing. Chances are you probably will use a drug that involves autonomic pharmacology. So you're going to use a drug that somehow affects the autonomic nervous system. And what we have here are all these receptors and the responses. Now, I'm keeping it pretty much limited to this table right here. There is a beta 3 receptor, beta 3 adrenergic receptor, but don't worry too much about it for this class. I think, yeah, there's only a footnote in Martini, and I'm not sure if the OpenStax actually, or I think the OpenStax does mention it. But let's talk about ligands and receptors. You might see this term a lot when you see some hear about drugs, especially if you're going to pharmacology and things that you'll definitely see ligands. So basically, a ligand is any sort of molecule or chemical that can bind to a receptor. Now, a membrane receptor, again, these are the protein receptors. So these are plasma membranes that bind to some sort of chemical that activates them. So why do I show this ignition here? It's kind of like a lock and a key. So the lock is like the receptor and the key is a ligand. But the thing is that, well, do you only need just one key to turn a lock? Well, if you have a car that has a valet key, that's not quite the full thing as your same thing as your full key, but it can still turn the lock and still cause the ignition. Or if you're really skilled, I don't think you can do that with modern cars, but they used to like hot wire or use some sort of like ways to kind of jimmy the ignition and turn it on. So, thing is that ligands is pretty much anything. So you have things that are natural to your body called endogenous ligands, but ligands can be any chemical that can, in theory, activate a receptor or actually block a receptor. So things that membrane receptors, these protein receptors, are not the same as those sensory cells and neurons. So now we're talking about the smaller version of these receptors. We're not talking about sensory neurons. Now things that so what I want you to know with ligands and receptors, just like the key and ignition, so when you have a ligand binding to a receptor, when you have a key going to ignition, it causes the cells to respond. So it's kind of like starting up something. It's causing some motion, some sort of response in the cells. And the thing is that different receptors cause different changes. So this is the thing is that you can have the same ligand, but depending on the receptor that's there, it can cause different effects. Okay, so then let's talk about agonist and antagonist. So now we're not talking using it in terms of muscle groups and movements. Now we're talking about actually about pharmacology. So a ligand, an agonist is something that activates the receptor and causes the typical activation of it. Now an antagonist, that's kind of like the antagonist when we're talking about muscle groups. It's opposing the agonist. So it's opposing the ligand that and this is a ligand. So they're both ligands, but one activates the receptor, the antagonist blocks and inhibits. Now, sympathetic neurotransmission. If you have a pen and paper, you might want to bring it out so you can draw this. Okay, so we're back. So what we have here is a pre-ganglionic neuron. So again, this is pre meaning before. So this is the neuron that leads to a ganglion, right? So then you have pre, and what's the opposite of pre? You have the postganglionic neuron that's from the ganglion. And then you have the target or effector organ. So this is eventually the organ you want to respond to sympathetic activity. So at the synapse between a preganglionic and postganglionic neuron, you have the preganglionic neuron releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and chemically the same as the acetylcholine you have in the neuromuscular junctions. And then it binds to a different type of receptors. These are called nicotinic receptors. And nicotinic receptors that are located on the membrane of a postganglionic neuron. So this is going to depolarize this postganglionic neuron, and this postganglionic neuron is going to release its own set of neurotransmitters. So depending on the tissue, so it can release either epinephrine or norepinephrine, or sometimes both. So it's going to release this epinephrine and norepinephrine, and it can bind to either, so these are two categories of adrenergic receptors. So these receptors, epinephrine and norepinephrine can bind to, so epinephrine can actually bind to either both alpha adrenergic receptors and beta adrenergic receptors. Norepinephrine can actually bind to both alpha adrenergic receptors and beta adrenergic receptors. So what we have here, well, basically at this synapse we have acetylcholine, and then at this synapse we have a different set of neurotransmitters. Norepinephrine we did cover earlier in the semester, but epinephrine is newer, and it's not the same thing as norepinephrine. Sounds similar, but it is different. And now you have two new receptors down here. So a mnemonic for this in sympathetic neurotransmission is SAN-bean. So what we have here, well, the S stands for sympathetic, and this part right here, so SAN stands for this first part right here, this AN, refers to the synapse between the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron. Oh, and actually this is another thing I noticed. So some other textbooks, they sometimes just call the postganglionic neuron the ganglionic neuron without the post part. They're one and the same. So don't, if you see ganglionic without the post, just know it's referring to postganglionic neuron. All right, so then that SAN part is referring to the AN part is referring to the acetylcholine, this synapse right here. But this part right here, now don't think it's only epinephrine to beta receptors. Do not think it's only norepinephrine to alpha receptors. This is actually a category altogether. So this is referring to the possible combinations that can happen at the synapse between the postganglionic neuron and its effective or target tissue or organ. So things that, again, this is not only beta and epi and not only alpha and norepi. It can actually be norepi and beta, alpha and epi as well.